The attic was cloaked in shadows, dust motes dancing like ghosts in the thin shafts of light sneaking through the cracked window. My hands trembled as I held the old recorder, its surface coated in decades of neglect. The air smelled stale, mixed with the faint scent of old wood and forgotten memories. I pressed play, and immediately, my father's voice filled the cramped space, raw and desperate. "If you're hearing this, please help me. Don't trust." The sentence was cut off mid-plea, the tape ending with a sharp, static snap. My breath hitched, heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst through my chest. The weight of those unfinished words settled over me like a cold fog, suffocating and heavy. I swallowed hard, the silence that followed almost worse than the terrified voice I just heard. Then, over the creaking floorboards behind me, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, steady. The same rhythm my brother used to make when we were kids. Sneaking up the stairs after bedtime, always sure I wouldn't hear. Only now it wasn't a game. My skin prickled. Every nerve screamed that this was no ordinary visit. I pressed the recorder closer to my chest, the cold plastic grounding me, but my hands barely stopped shaking. The attic seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching longer, darker, as those footsteps drew nearer. My mind raced, piecing together the years of stories, the lies, the silences I'd never understood before. I whispered into the camera, voice barely audible, "I think my brother heard the tape too." And in that moment, the truth slammed into me like a freight train. The man who vanished wasn't lost by chance. He was gone because my brother wanted it that way. And now, I was trapped under the same roof, caught in a game where the stakes were far more terrifying than I'd ever imagined. Stay with me. There's more unraveling in the shadows, and every detail counts. Don't blink now. What's next will change everything you thought you knew. When Dad disappeared, it was as if the whole world tilted and left us dangling in a void. Mom, who had always been a pillar of quiet strength, crumbled into something unrecognizable. She didn't cry much, at least not in front of us. But the way she moved through the house was like she was underwater, slow and distant. Meals were forgotten, dishes piled up, and her eyes lost their spark, staring blankly out the window as if waiting for something that would never come back. I remember the nights when I'd wake up to find her sitting on the floor in the dark, clutching a photograph of Dad like it was a lifeline, whispering his name over and over until her voice cracked. I was too young to understand what grief was, but I felt the weight of her absence, heavier than the silence that filled the rooms. In that fractured space, my older brother rose like a shadow, taking over Dad's place with a strange intensity that felt both comforting and unsettling. He didn't just mimic Dad's routines. He became a ritual himself. Every morning, he brewed the same bitter coffee Dad used to drink, the smell curling through the kitchen like a ghost. He wore Dad's old watch, the one with the cracked glass, and carried the same worn toolbox that Dad kept under the sink. At night, he patrolled the house, checking every lock and window with a seriousness that made me believe he was the last line of defense against the darkness pressing in on us. He spoke to me in tones that mixed reassurance with something colder beneath the surface. "Dad left," he said once, his voice steady but distant. "People do that, but I'm here now. I'm the one who keeps us safe." I clung to those words as though they were a shield. I admired him more than anyone else on earth. He was the brother who shielded me from the storm, the man who carried the weight of a family that seemed ready to fall apart. I trusted him blindly, without question, because what else could I do? In his presence, the house felt alive again, like maybe we could survive this nightmare together. But even as I worshipped him, a strange unease was always there, lurking just beneath my skin. Sometimes, when I watched him, his face would harden in ways Dad's never did, his eyes flashing with something I couldn't name. There were moments when his voice dropped low, almost a whisper, when he muttered things I couldn't understand, fragments of threats or promises or maybe curses. I tried to ignore those shadows, telling myself that this was the cost of keeping us safe. Yet, the cracks in his stories began to appear, subtle at first but impossible to miss if you looked closely. He told me about Dad's disappearance like it was a simple fact, but the details never quite added up. He said Dad left because he wanted to, that he was a man who couldn't be tied down. Yet sometimes, I caught him staring at the back door, his jaw clenched tight, as if he were waiting for something or someone that wasn't coming. There were nights when I heard him moving around the house in the dark, whispering names I didn't recognize, his footsteps echoing like a warning. The warmth I had felt toward him began to twist, mixing with a cold knot of fear I couldn't explain. Still, I needed him. I needed that illusion of unity he created, the idea that he was the protector who held everything together. Without him, we were just broken pieces scattered across a cold floor. But deep down, I sensed that his protection came at a price, one I wasn't ready to pay or even fully understand. The house was alive with secrets, and he was the keeper of them all, silent, watchful, and waiting for the moment when the cracks would finally split wide open. The house whispered its unease in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a child's mind weaving stories out of creaking floorboards and shifting shadows. But looking back now, those subtle signs were the first fractures in the fragile world my brother tried so hard to maintain. The locked doors were the earliest and most persistent clues. Dad's office was always shut tight, the door heavy and cold to the touch, like a barrier not just of wood but of memories better left untouched. My brother never gave a clear reason why we weren't allowed in. "It's Dad's space," he'd say, voice low and final. "Not ours." I accepted it then, because challenging him felt like stepping onto thin ice. But the truth was that office was a fortress, an altar to a past we weren't permitted to explore. The shed outside was worse in some ways. It sat off to the side of the yard, a dark silhouette against the fading light of dusk, its door padlocked with a stubborn chain. My brother clutched the key like a talisman, never letting it out of his sight. I remember once, when curiosity gnawed too hard at my patience, I crept out to the shed after he'd gone to bed. The lock resisted my attempts. The cold metal bit into my fingers, and the faint sound of something shifting inside made my skin crawl. I backed away, heart pounding, the night suddenly thick with menace. The shed wasn't just off-limits. It was a vault for secrets too dangerous to face. And then there was the attic, the highest point of the house, where dust motes danced lazily in shafts of afternoon light, where the air tasted dry and old. My brother's prohibition was absolute. "Too painful," he said. "You don't want to see what's up there." But what child could resist? I remember standing at the bottom of the creaky staircase, gazing up into the dimness, the weight of his warning pressing down on me like a silent command. Later, I realized the attic was a shrine to a version of our family story sanitized and controlled, where memories were boxed up and hidden away, safely out of reach. Within the house, my brother's control extended beyond locked doors. He mapped out territories with invisible lines, rooms we could enter freely, and others where his presence was a silent sentry. He managed who could be where, when. The kitchen, always spotless, was his domain in the mornings, where he brewed coffee in silence, eyes distant. The living room was a neutral zone, but even there, I felt the tension under the surface, a current of unspoken rules. The house itself seemed to bend under his will, a stage set for a performance none of us fully understood. The silence in those rooms was oppressive. No laughter echoed through the halls. No music filled the air. Just the soft sounds of footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the occasional sigh. Shadows seemed to gather in corners, thickening as dusk fell, waiting to swallow the light. I remember lying awake in my bed, the walls pressing in, the house breathing around me like a living thing holding its breath. Sometimes I'd hear my brother moving through the halls in the dead of night, his footsteps deliberate and slow, as if he was pacing to keep something at bay. Now, I see those childhood memories with a new clarity. The strict boundaries, the locked doors, the whispered warnings, they weren't just arbitrary rules. They were the first signs of a fractured reality, a family fractured by unspoken truths and carefully guarded lies. The house was less a home and more a cage, each locked room a cell containing pieces of a story too painful, too dangerous to confront. In that silence, I learned to tread lightly, to obey the invisible rules that kept the fragile peace intact. But the house never stopped hinting at what lay beneath the surface. The secrets my brother kept hidden, the memories he tried to erase. The tension was always there, a slow-burning ember beneath the quiet, waiting for the moment when everything would finally catch fire. The moment I stepped back inside the house, the air shifted. It wasn't just the stale scent of dust and old wood that clung to the walls. It was something heavier, tighter, like the space itself was holding its breath. I could feel it pressing down, a weight I hadn't noticed before, or maybe had chosen to ignore. The house was the same and yet not. It was a stage set for a play I hadn't rehearsed for, and my brother was already on it, watching. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway of the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes narrowing slightly whenever I moved. Not in welcome, but in calculation. I caught that sharp glance when I reached for a glass, when I brushed past the living room where Dad's old belongings sat on a faded shelf. His posture stiffened like a coiled spring. It was subtle, but I noticed because it was new. The attic door was the real test. I found myself drawn to it, the familiar worn handle cold under my fingers, the threshold to memories better left untouched. Every time I reached out, he would appear behind me, his shadow stretching long in the dim hallway light. He didn't say a word, just stood there, jaw clenched, eyes hard and unreadable. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken rules and warnings. One evening, I lingered too long by Dad's old desk, running my fingers over the scattered papers and brittle photographs. I was searching for what I wasn't sure. Closure? Answers? A way to piece together the fragments of a childhood that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. That's when he stepped in, voice low but firm. "Don't touch that." The words were simple, but the edge in them was sharp enough to cut through the quiet. I looked up and met his gaze. There was something there I hadn't seen before, something defensive, almost feral. His shoulders tensed, and his eyes flicked away quickly, like he was struggling to contain something just beneath the surface. I wanted to ask what he was hiding, but the question stuck in my throat. Instead, I pulled my hand back slowly, the unspoken truce settling between us like a fragile glass. Days passed and the pattern worsened. He followed my movements with a hawk's precision. A glance here, a sudden appearance there. It wasn't concern, it was surveillance. I could feel his eyes tracking every step, every breath. My presence had disturbed the carefully balanced ecosystem of the house, and he was trying to restore order, whatever the cost. The silence between us grew louder, filling every corner with tension. Conversations became clipped, exchanges brief and loaded. At dinner, he sat rigid, barely touching his food, watching me as if I might vanish the moment he looked away. I caught him stealing glances at the attic door, his fingers twitching as if aching to close it forever. One night I couldn't sleep. The house creaked and groaned around me, the shadows lengthening like fingers reaching out to pull me back into the past. I slipped out of my room and moved toward the attic, drawn by a pull I couldn't explain. Halfway there, I froze. My brother was standing just outside, eyes dark and unreadable in the faint light. His lips pressed into a thin line, a silent warning that echoed louder than any shout. "Don't," he whispered, voice barely audible but loaded with meaning. It wasn't just about the attic or the belongings inside. It was about the truths buried beneath the floorboards, the memories locked away in silence. His body was taut with something fierce, fear, anger, maybe guilt. I realized then that he had been guarding more than just a door. He was guarding a secret, one that threatened to unravel everything we thought we knew. The house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a battleground, and my brother had already drawn his lines. I was no longer the returning daughter or the caring sibling. I was an intruder, a threat to the fragile order he had built from years of silence and shadows. And as I stood there, caught between the past and the present, I understood that the real battle was only just beginning. The attic air was thick with dust, each breath tasting faintly of old wood and forgotten years. The morning sun filtered weakly through a grimy window, casting long, wavering shadows across the cluttered floor. I had only intended to clear a small corner, to make space, but the attic seemed to resist, groaning under the weight of so many lost memories. As I shifted an ancient blanket, stiff and brittle with age, my fingers brushed against something solid, tucked away behind a loose board. Pulling it free, I revealed a small wooden box, its surface worn but unmistakable. My father's initials carved delicately into the lid. The box was heavier than I expected, the wood dense and cold beneath my fingertips. Lifting it, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread coil tight in my stomach. The dust swirled in the pale light as I eased the lid open, releasing a faint, musty scent. A blend of old paper, fading leather, and something faintly metallic. Inside, the contents lay arranged with an eerie care. Faded photographs showing Dad with bruises I'd never seen. A half-burned letter whose words were smudged and incomplete. His old wristwatch with its cracked glass face. And finally, a recorder wrapped carefully in a fraying cloth. My hands trembled as I unwrapped the recorder, the fabric rustling like a whisper. The device was bulky, heavy in a way that made the moment feel more real, like I was holding a piece of Dad's last desperation. The buttons were stiff with age, but the play button gave slightly under my finger. I hesitated, the silence around me thick and oppressive. A cold sweat broke out across my palms as I pressed down, the faint mechanical whir of the recorder piercing the heavy silence of the attic. Then his voice came, raw and broken, more fragile than I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the steady, calm tone I remembered. It was whispered, ragged, as if he was hiding, trying not to be heard. "If you're hearing this," he began, voice cracking with panic. There was a long pause, filled only by the faint creak of floorboards or the distant tapping of something. Something or someone moving. "They're inside. I don't know how long I can keep this up. The walls have ears. I can hear them now, just outside the don't trust." His words trailed off into a hurried breath, sharp and shallow. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the quiet. The recorder caught the scrape of heavy footsteps, a shuffling struggle, and then a muffled scream that sent a jolt of ice through my chest. The panic in Dad's voice was palpable, a raw terror I had never imagined he could feel. His breathing became ragged, desperate. "Please, if you find this..." The message ended abruptly, cut off by a sound like something heavy falling and then silence. Bone-deep, suffocating silence. I sat frozen, the recorder slipping from my fingers onto the floor with a dull thud. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a warning. I had never heard my father sound afraid. Not like this. The man who had always been my protector now seemed small and vulnerable, caught in some nightmare I didn't understand. Questions flooded my mind. What was he hiding? Who was they? And how long had this terror been lurking? Just beyond the walls of the house I thought I knew. The attic around me suddenly felt colder, the shadows darker. I stared at the box, the photographs, the letter, everything now charged with a new, terrifying weight. My shock was profound, and confusion tangled with it like a thick fog. Nothing made sense anymore. The secret my father had guarded so fiercely wasn't just a shadow of the past. It was a living, breathing threat, and I had just pulled the first thread. After I pressed play on the recording, the room seemed to close in on me, the voices echoing louder than I expected. My brother's voice, calm yet strained, telling things I never heard before, twisting the story I thought I knew. Suddenly, every memory I had of him flickered, reframed in a sinister light I couldn't shake. That night, Dad's disappearance, was no longer a simple fracture in our lives, but a labyrinth of half-truths and silences. I remembered him waking me up, his eyes wild, the urgency in his voice that had seemed protective then, but now felt like something else entirely. His hands were shaking, but his clothes were dry. I had always believed he'd been searching the backyard, drenched in the rain, desperate to find Dad. But the recording mentioned the truck not being gone, just hidden, behind the woodshed, where the police found it 2 days later. Why hadn't he told me that? Why hadn't he told anyone? He had been in control from the start, steering the investigation with a quiet insistence, cutting off every question I tried to ask. "Dad left us," he'd said, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. I thought he was shielding me from pain, But now I realize it was a shield for himself, a barrier to keep the truth out. And what truth was he so afraid of? I started piecing together the contradictions. He claimed he was scared, vulnerable, but his behavior was often cold, calculating. The day after Dad disappeared, he was already making decisions. Talking to neighbors, directing the police, even managing what news got out. That wasn't panic. It was control. I remembered the way he avoided looking me in the eyes, how sometimes his smile would slip into something unreadable, sharp as broken glass. I had thought it was just stress, grief. Now it felt like a mask. There were those subtle moments I had buried. The night before Dad vanished, he'd been unusually quiet at dinner, almost tense. Later, I found him in the garage, whispering to someone on the phone, his voice low and urgent. When I asked who it was, he brushed me off. I never pushed, but that moment now feels like a crack in the story he told. The story I accepted as truth for so long. Even his stories about Dad didn't add up. He said Dad was unstable, that he'd been drinking more, that he might have left because he couldn't handle it anymore. But the recording hinted at something darker, something Dad had found or knew, something that made him a target. Why had my brother never mentioned that? Was it to protect me, or was it to hide his own involvement? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many times I'd ignored the unease threading through our childhood. The way he watched me sometimes as if measuring, calculating. The sudden changes in his mood, the secretive glances, the way he would shut down when I asked about Dad. Those moments now felt like warnings I had failed to heed. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. Betrayal, yes, but also fear. Fear of what I didn't know. Fear of what my brother might have done or concealed. The man I thought was my protector might have been the architect of my father's absence. The foundation of my memories was cracking, and beneath it, a darker truth waited, one I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Every laugh we shared as kids now echoed with a hollow edge. Every argument, every secret glance, every whispered reassurance. It all felt like part of a carefully constructed facade. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the voice inside me was strangled by doubt. Could I trust my own memories? Could I trust him? Or was I just another piece in a puzzle I never wanted to solve? I sat back, the recording still humming softly, and realized the nightmare wasn't just in the past. It was alive, breathing in the shadows of my brother's silence. The nights grew colder, and the house tightened around me like a noose. I moved cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, every sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. I was certain he was awake, waiting, listening. I had stopped trusting the sound of his breathing, the faintest movement in the dark making me freeze in place. My fingers grazed the edge of the attic door, the place I had already searched countless times, but each new visit felt like peeling back another layer of something dark and suffocating. Dinner was the worst. The table was set meticulously, as if to mock the fragile peace we pretended to have. He sat across from me, his eyes never leaving my face, studying every flicker of expression, every subtle tremor in my hands. I could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. The food tasted like ash, but I forced myself to chew, to swallow, to breathe. He didn't speak, and I didn't dare break the silence. Words were weapons neither of us wanted to brandish. Yet, sometimes I caught him rearranging things around the house. A book moved from the shelf, a chair shifted slightly, a photograph tilted just enough to unsettle the frame. These small acts were like silent messages, reminders that he was watching, that he controlled the space we shared. I found myself double-checking every door, every lock, as if the house itself was conspiring against me. The rooms that once felt familiar had become alien territory, each one a trap waiting to snap shut. He started leaving lights on in the rooms I had just darkened, a subtle form of surveillance. It was as if he was erasing my presence, undoing my every move. When I turned the lights off again, I caught a glimpse of his shadow lingering just beyond the doorway, a silent sentinel. One night, I found the attic door wide open, the dim light spilling down the stairs like an invitation or a warning. I wanted to retreat, but the need to find answers pushed me forward. Late at night, with the house silent except for the hum of the heater, I crept through the halls, flashlight in hand, searching for something, anything, that could explain the tension, the secrets. I sifted through old boxes, letters, and photographs, my heart pounding as if it knew what horrors might be hidden beneath the dust. Every creak made me jump. Every whisper of movement sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't sure if I was being watched, or if the paranoia was just my mind unraveling. When I finally confronted him in the kitchen, his presence was suffocating. He stood behind me longer than usual, his breath warm against my neck. "You've been in the attic, haven't you?" he asked softly, not accusing, but stating a fact. I didn't answer. The silence between us was heavier than any words could be. The nights blended into days, and the house became a cage, each wall closing in tighter. I was trapped in a psychological war with a man who knew I knew, and every moment was a calculated move in a game neither of us wanted to end. The line between paranoia and reality blurred, and I found myself wondering if I was losing my mind, or if he was letting me lose it on purpose. When I opened the door to my room that night, the air felt thick, heavier than usual. My breath hitched. There, sitting squarely on my bed, was the attic box, the one I'd left untouched for weeks, as if hoping the past would stay buried. But something was wrong. The small recorder, the last thread I clung to, was missing. I didn't have to look around to know who was there. In the dark corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim hallway light, he sat. My brother, calm, unmoving, elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely intertwined. His eyes locked onto me with a cold, steady gaze that made my skin crawl. "Why are you here?" My voice cracked before I could stop it. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted slightly, the faintest sound in the silence. Then, almost casually, he spoke, his voice low but deliberate. "Dad was hurting Mom," he said. I blinked, trying to process the weight of those words. The shock twisted inside me, but I stayed silent. "You were too young to know," he continued, his tone neither pleading nor angry, just certain. I stopped him. I saved us. The way he said, "I stopped him," wasn't a confession. It wasn't a cry for forgiveness or an admission of guilt. It was a statement of fact, delivered with chilling conviction. His eyes didn't waver, didn't soften. Instead, they held something far more terrifying, pride. A sense of righteousness that made my blood run cold. "You don't understand," he said, leaning forward just enough for the shadows to carve sharp angles into his face. "He was going to destroy everything. Mom was scared out of her mind, and you were just a kid, couldn't let it go on. Someone had to take control." I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, that there had to be another way. But the truth was tangled, buried beneath years of silence and manipulation. And now, he was twisting it into a story where he was the hero, the savior who decided who lived and who didn't. "I didn't kill him because I wanted to," he said, voice steady, almost gentle. "I did it because it had to be done. Because if I didn't, none of us would be here. None of this would be possible." The room seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing in as I struggled to find my voice. "You think that makes it right?" He smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. Just a slow, unsettling curve of his lips. "Right? Wrong? Those are just words people use when they don't want to face the truth. I did what was necessary. And you're a problem now. A loose end." The words hit me like a punch. I realized then that this wasn't about remorse or regret. He wasn't haunted by what he'd done. He was convinced he'd done the right thing, and that anyone who challenged his version of the past was a threat to be eliminated. I wanted to believe there was still good in him, some flicker of the brother I once knew. But the darkness in his eyes told me otherwise. He stood up slowly, the silence between us growing thick again. "You need to understand," he said quietly. "I'm not the same person you remember, and I won't hesitate to do what's necessary again." The finality in his voice was like a verdict. I saw the truth laid bare in his gaze. He was capable of it, of doing it again. And this time I was the one in the crosshairs. It began subtly at first, almost imperceptible. like a flicker of a shadow in a familiar room. But the pattern emerged, and with every passing day, it tightened around me like a noose. The locks. He checked them obsessively. Once, twice, sometimes 3 times in a row, each click echoing louder in my chest than the last. The door wasn't just secured. It was barricaded, as if expecting an invasion. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, some residue of grief still clinging to his mind, but deep down, I knew better. Then came the power outages. At first, they were brief, almost playful interruptions, as if he were testing the boundaries of control. The lights would snap off without warning, plunging the house into darkness, and I'd find him standing there, silent and still, like a predator watching his prey flail in the dark. Sometimes the blackout lasted only seconds, other times minutes, but each time the darkness felt heavier, more pressing, suffocating in its silence. I could almost hear the ticking of a clock, counting down to something worse. He started standing outside my door, too. Not knocking, not calling out, just lingering. The way he moved, silently, like a shadow that stretched long and cold against the cracked wood. I caught him more than once, those dark eyes fixed on me, watching, waiting. I stopped leaving my door unlocked. I stopped looking toward it when I heard his steps. But the fear was always there, crawling under my skin, whispering that I wasn't safe even in my own room. Then the tools. I found them scattered, wrenches, screwdrivers, blades, left carelessly out of place. At first, I thought it was forgetfulness, but the precision with which they were arranged told another story. Each tool was within reach, a silent threat disguised as an accident. I imagined the cold steel in his hands, the ease with which he could turn any object into a weapon. The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to breathe, to stay rational, stay alive. And then he said it. "We should talk outside," he said quietly one evening, his voice low and steady, the kind of calm that doesn't invite questions. "Away from the house." The words were innocent enough on their own, but layered beneath was a menace I couldn't ignore, a veiled promise that the walls wouldn't protect me anymore. My mind raced back to that night, the night Dad died, the night the house was plunged into that same oppressive silence. I remembered the way he moved, the way he controlled everything with a ruthless precision. And now he wanted me outside, alone, vulnerable. The realization hit me with a cold, brutal clarity. My father didn't disappear by accident. He was eliminated. And now my brother was following the same script, rehearsing the same cruel choreography with me as the next victim. Fear surged through me, thick and choking, a dark tide pulling me under. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but the weight of that knowledge made it nearly impossible. I knew exactly how he thought because I grew up idolizing the man who orchestrated my father's end. The man who once was my hero was now my executioner in waiting. I felt the walls closing in, the house no longer a refuge but a cage. Every shadow became a threat, every silence a warning. The suffocating tension twisted tighter around my chest with each passing moment, and I understood. This was no longer just about survival. It was about outsmarting a darkness born from the blood of our family. And I was running out of time. I slipped through the dim hallway, breath shallow and heart pounding like a trapped bird. Every creak beneath my feet echoed louder than the pounding storm outside. The house seemed alive, watching, waiting. I reached the back door, the only way out, but it was locked tight, the cold steel mocking my desperation. My hands trembled as I searched for the keys I'd hidden weeks ago. A secret lifeline I barely dared hope was still there. The faintest whisper floated from the walls, a breath too close, too familiar. His shadow loomed in the doorway behind me, quiet, unyielding. The man who once cradled me in his arms now stood like a ghost of menace, eyes hollow, promises broken. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see what I already knew. Fumbling with the lock, a chill ran down my spine. His voice, low and steady, filled the room. "You can't leave. Not yet." No anger, no fury, just the quiet certainty of a predator who's waited too long. I snapped the latch open and pushed the door wide, the biting wind rushing in with cruel urgency. I stepped outside, the night swallowing me whole. The house groaned behind me, the sinister heartbeat fading but never gone. I didn't look back. Somewhere beneath the fading storm, I knew he would wait for me, waiting for the next time the walls closed in, waiting for the moment I slipped again. The darkness wasn't just in the house. It was in me now, a shadow that would never quite leave. And as the night swallowed me whole, I realized that escape was only the beginning of a different kind of captivity. If you want to unravel more stories about what really festers beneath the surface, stay under the same roof with me. There's a lot more I haven't told yet,